Today is one of those opportunities, like you and I all have at some point in our lives, to have a chance to interact with people that really have inspired you. And that today, for me, is the opportunity to meet and have a chance to have this conversation with the great Senator Phil Gramm. And Senator Gramm, welcome back to ALEC.
Thank you. Thank you.
Now, Senator Gramm really doesn't need an introduction, but I'm going to just point out a couple of things that you and I were talking about earlier before we started. One was that Senator Gramm was the author of Ronald Reagan's budget, and he did it when he was still a Democrat in the United States House of Representatives. Think about that for a moment. That doesn't happen very much these days. Also, as a trained economist, a professor at Texas A&M, I don't know about you all, I think we need more free market economists in public service these days and fewer of other professions. And that will remain unnamed, but I think you all know what I'm thinking about in that case. The other thing was, and I think this is the best introduction anybody could receive, and that is, it's not often I quote Paul Krugman. We're not a big fan of Paul Krugman's economic ideas here at ALEC, but Paul Krugman once described you as the high priest of deregulation. And I don't know if there's a better badge of honor you can have, but being called that by Paul Krugman. So Senator Gramm, you have an incredible new book out that I have a copy of, The Triumph of Economic Freedom. Talk to us about the myths that you identify in that amazing book and what kind of implications that state legislators that are here with us can take from it.
Well, the first of those myths is that the Industrial Revolution impoverished workers, when in reality the Industrial Revolution was the most positive thing that ever happened to mankind on the face of the earth. The economy, which had not grown in 1,000 years, in 100 years in the 19th century, grew by biblical proportions and changed the world. The problem is it upset the social order, and it was basically a workers' revolution. And so you have all of the losers of that process, who were the old established autocracy in Great Britain, who wrote all this Victorian literature about how terrible the Industrial Revolution was. And it's very relevant to AI. In fact, it is very relevant that we understand what happened in the Industrial Revolution and the picture that is now painted in every high school and college textbook in America. Because this is exactly what I see and what I think will happen in AI. There will be two stories. The one story will be the extraordinary progress, and the other story will be the people who feel they're losing from the process. And so I think we have a lot to learn from the Industrial Revolution, and it's very encouraging. We have never had a major technological change adopted in the history of the world that did not make mankind better off. This is not going to be the first that doesn't.
Well, thank you. And one thing, I know we have a lot of folks that serve on appropriations and finance committees here in their state legislative bodies. They all are probably thinking the same as me. Is talk to us a little bit about that Reagan budget and maybe what kind of budget lessons that legislators at the federal and state level can learn from that. You and I were talking a little bit about the federal assets piece of that, and I know we have a lot of members west of the Rockies here, our Utah delegation and some of our other great delegations in the whole issue of federal lands. But one of the things that you and I talked about was this uncovering of what the federal government owns and what can we do to maybe address the national debt.
Well, you got to understand the background that the Reagan Revolution grew out of. We had inflation for 9 years at 9.2%. The economy was in crisis, and we had an opportunity to make dramatic changes. And the problem in the 1970s was that with the runaway inflation and 26 different tax brackets, Americans were rising because of inflation up the tax bracket system, and the tax rate was exploding, and government revenues reached an all-time peace level revenue collection in 1980. And so we had a difficult task of bringing spending under control and reducing the tax burden to encourage people to work, save, and invest. And the good news is we were able not to cut spending as much as we needed to cut it, but we were able to bring spending under control, reduce it, and then keep it in check, basically for 25 years, as the economy grew up to the size of government. You and I were talking about selling of assets. One of the ideas that I tried to push during the Reagan Revolution was to sell off some of the assets that government owns, massive amounts of land in the West, extraordinary assets all over the country, many of which are used very inefficiently. But it was a difficult slog.
So one of the big issues that you point out, a really powerful lesson from the book, is just how government intervention, whether it's price controls, wage controls, things that apply themselves at the state level with the minimum wage proposals or caps on interest rates or interchange ideas. Talk to us about the issue of big government price controls and how you see that playing out today.
Well, first of all, I don't need to tell you that when you're spending somebody else's money, you spend it differently than you spend your own money. And that's the first point. Secondly, government is by its very nature inefficient as compared to the market because of limited information. And then you've got political pressures that induce actions that are often popular but very harmful, the minimum wage being a perfect example. And I don't know how many people are here from Oklahoma, but congratulations on the election where Oklahoma voters actually defeated an increase in the minimum wage. Once when I was in the Senate, there was a move to raise the minimum wage. And so I was in a mean mood that day, and so I offered an amendment to raise the minimum wage to $100 an hour. And the Democrats just went berserk, and some of the Republicans as well, I should say. And so I made the point, look, if we can just pass laws and make wages whatever we want them to be, why should we be cheap?
Just go the full way.
So, but anyway, after many tears were shed that people didn't want to vote on a $100 minimum wage, they pulled the bill down, so.
Oh, that's great. Maybe some good ideas for people that want to address that back home. So we do have some pieces of model policy on your chairs and all the tables, I know, dealing with price control issues as well, so check that out. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about, oftentimes the free market and especially deregulation gets blamed for things like the financial crisis. You address that in your book because we have a lot of legislators here that are pursuing deregulatory policies. Great victory in just South Carolina a couple of weeks ago, in Oklahoma, and so many of your states doing things like the REINS Act and addressing the Chevron deference opportunities that we have now with the Supreme Court decision.
Well, basically what happened during the financial crisis, or as I like to call it, subprime crisis, is that we had a concerted government policy to try to expand the number of people who own their own homes. A relatively good intention, I would say. But they did it by pressuring the banks to make subprime loans through a bill called the Community Reinvestment Act, and then pressuring Freddie and Fannie to buy and securitize those loans with quotas that started out at 30% of all their securitized loans had to be subprime. And by the time the wheels came off, it was 56%. And then the capital standards of banks treated mortgage-backed securities as the equivalent of sovereign debt. And so it all worked as long as housing prices were rising. But when the increase in housing prices stopped occurring and actually declined, people who had no down payment, no stake in the game, and no ability to pay in many cases simply threw the key over their left shoulder on the living room rug and walked out the door. And so we had a massive default. Now, the argument is made by people who wanted to use the subprime crisis to expand the power of government, that Greenspan kept interest rates too low. But real rates in the post-war period were much lower in other periods than they were in the build-up to the subprime crisis. And yet nowhere else is there a crisis. And then the argument that there was this massive deregulation, no one has ever been able to point out where that deregulation occurred. The government had more power, more regulators, higher budgets in bank regulation, and there's no evidence that if it had 10 times as much, that it would have made any difference because there was a conflict. They had a safety and soundness mandate, but they had a housing mandate. And the housing mandate was more popular with those in power than the safety and soundness. So it's a perfect example of where a crisis occurs, and to promote an objective, the view of that crisis is bent to try to conform to what you would want to argue to get done what you wanted to do. We should have reformed the housing system instead of the banking system.
Great. Well, so one of the most pervasive arguments out there that you address in your book that I know all of you have to deal with in your states, especially if you're doing things like trying to cut taxes. We have several states in the midst of battles to try to even eliminate their income tax right now, like Missouri and Oklahoma and Mississippi and others that have in law pledged to do that. You address the myth of inequality and some of the progressive ideas that get in the way of these free market policy discussions.
Well, you got to remember that when you see these statistics about inequality, that the Census Bureau does not count government transfer payments that are made in kind, that is, where they don't give you cash, like food stamps, you get a debit card but not cash, housing subsidies, Medicaid, that the Census Bureau doesn't count any of that income as any of those payments as income. So the Census Bureau says the top 20% of Americans has 16.7 times as much income as the bottom 20%, but when you take into account the value of the transfer payments and the loss of income from taxes, the ratio is actually 4 to 1 and not 16.7 to 1. Now, you can say 4 to 1 is too much, but it's a different debate. And then the point about the super rich. I guess I've got 2 points to make about that. First of all, Elon Musk is the richest person in the world, but he made me richer. Not richer than him, but richer than I was, because I was paying a big fee for an internet system in my attic. I had to work. I have a young wife who wants money and would put me in a cheap nursing home if I quit working. And so I had to pay for that system. But he came along with a satellite that was 1/10 the cost and 3 times as good. So he got rich on it, but I benefited from it. How am I poor because Warren Buffett is richer? He's made the market work more efficiently. As Steve Moore pointed out, look at what's happened to equity values. Look at what has happened to the retirement program of every college professor in America. Rarely does someone teach a career at any college or university and participate in something like TIAA craft that they don't retire a millionaire.
That's right.
So the system is working. As long as you've got opportunity and freedom, you're going to have inequality. Freedom and equality are sworn and eternal enemies. When you have one, you don't have the other. I prefer freedom, and I think America has always preferred it, and as a result, we have always been richer, freer, and happier than anybody else in the world. And I want to keep it that way.
Well, amen to that, and thank you so much, Senator Gramm. You will continue to be an inspiration to so many of us, and thank you for your service to America.
And thank you for your service. The future of America is in the states, not in the federal government.
Thank you, Senator Gramm.
Hold on, let me get up. Thank you.